I'm sure you can tell that we had to work with Doug to get his enthusiasm up for this. He came in just a couple of minutes over, which is pretty good for him. We appreciate it, Doug. And even though he's already introduced General Thurman, I wanted to take a moment to thank Tom Thurman coming out of retirement, in effect, to come down and do this. He spent a lot of hours in preparation for this because we made him shrink his usual presentation on this, and I think you're going to find it very fascinating. He doesn't hold anything back. So, former Deputy District Attorney General, better known as the Thurminator, Tom Thurman.
It's a surprise to me that they shrunk my presentation. When I first agreed to do this, they told me it'll be 20 minutes on the Trimble trial, and I said, well, I can handle that. That's no big deal. Next thing I know, it's an hour, and then later, now it's an hour and 15 minutes. And that's it. You know, after north of 100 jury trials, I'm not sure my old vocal cords can go for an hour and 15 minutes, to tell you the truth. So what I do, I go out last weekend and carve a pumpkin out in the cold for an hour and 15 minutes, and next thing I know, I've got a sinus infection. So I'm not dipping skull. That's actually a cough drop in my cheek there. So, and I'll apologize ahead of time if my voice starts breaking, but hopefully I can make it through this. I'd like to thank Doug for using most of my presentation. So we'll have to go over a little bit more. And Ed said there wasn't any humor in this case, and there's not much, that's for sure, a very serious case. Doug had some humor in his book when he called me an accomplished golfer and a competitive triathlete. All my friends, and my wife included, got a really good laugh out of that one. I got involved in this case in 1990. I was the deputy district attorney, and part of my duties were to be liaison with the murder squad. Captain Mickey Miller came in at that time to take over the murder squad, and I guess I shouldn't say he was obsessed, but he was highly motivated to try and solve the Marcia Trimble case. He reopened it, and about that same time, this slide came from Memphis in 1990, which was purported to be a vaginal swab slide from Marcia Trimble's autopsy. So that was tested, and they found male DNA on it from semen. They also found a mixture of 3 to 5 different individuals on that slide. So that added fuel to the fire even more of the investigation. So Captain Miller and Lieutenant Jacobs and some of his people probably spent thousands of hours on this case, re-interviewing witnesses, going over the evidence, taking DNA samples from practically everybody in Green Hills. It was a male, I think, and pursuing the case. They worked really hard on it, and then eventually I knew what was going on, but they come to the office to meet with Tori and myself. And they have a little green book with like 20 pages in it with diagrams and all this kind of stuff. And they say, you know, we're ready. And the book says, evidence that proves Jeffrey Womack killed Marcia Trimble. So we agreed to look at it, of course, but I knew what was in there. So we reviewed it, and of course we had an ethical duty to protect the innocent as well as pursue the guilty. So we looked at the case and said, there's no way. You just can't fit. They tried to fit it into a timeline and do this, and it just didn't work. They had some unusual circumstances. Jeffrey was his worst enemy, I think, in this situation. He made some stupid statements and did some stupid things, but we didn't feel there was evidence that he was a murderer. So it went kind of slowed down a lot after that, although Captain Miller kept working on it while he was still there at the murder squad. In 2002, we started a cold case unit, and that was a cooperative unit between the district attorney's office and the police department that actually operated out of our office, and I was a liaison with that. Two good things had come out of Captain Miller's reopening investigation that turned out to be the first lucky break we got in this case was he resubmitted Marcia Trimble's blouse. She'd been found into the FBI. The FBI had already tested that blouse, and I'll show you a chain of evidence a little bit later. And normal procedure for them is if they've tested an item, they will not retest it. But in this particular case, being the FBI, they'd lost all their notes. So they agreed to retest it. which was really a stroke of luck for us because the new testing did discover semen on that blouse that had not been discovered before, and they were able to get a DNA profile off of that blouse, which was put into CODIS, the national database. It didn't get a hit at that time for any suspects, but they now had a profile off that blouse, which we'd never had before. Captain Miller also sent the jeans Marsh had been wearing to a lab in California where they had a different type of DNA they were doing at that time that specialized in getting profiles from smaller amounts of DNA, and they were able to get a partial profile on the jeans at that time also that you could use for a potential match. So those are two really good things that came out of the investigation. The cold case unit in 2002 got started and very successful early on, solved a lot of cases, but we weren't really looking at Marcia Trimble anymore because of thousands of man hours had been spent, and there were so many other cases out there. So it was just there, kind of. 2007, fast forward to there, we had just had two major cold case trials, the Music Row murder trial and then the Perry March case. So we were kind of sitting back and trying to catch our breath a little bit after some major trials and relax just a little bit, and then the call came. That was the second lucky break we got in solving the Marcia Trimble case. The call came from Sarah DePrey's younger sister, who had been very young when she'd been killed. And she was just inquiring with the murder squad, Sergeant Paciglione, what had happened with her sister's case. And of course, Pat and Bill, neither one even heard of the case. They didn't know. So they found the file. They dug through, and miracle upon miracles, they found the file. Some 30 years later. There wasn't a lot in it because there hadn't been a lot of investigation done on the particular case. But they found the file, and from there they did. Our protocol was, first thing we do in cold case homicides is we look to see what evidence has been tested and what hasn't been, and what we can send off for scientific testing, mostly DNA, obviously. And that was our first step we always used. So they went to the property room to attempt to find the evidence. Well, evidence wasn't where it was supposed to be. They looked and looked and looked, couldn't find it. And the third lucky break was they didn't quit. You know, a normal detective might have said, well, evidence is missing, I'm moving on, going back to the office. They kept looking, and finally in this corner, not where it's supposed to be, was this dusty old box, and they opened it up, and there was Sarah DePrey's clothes, her blouse she'd been wearing, and also her sheets and her pillowcase. They hadn't been tested, so they sent them to the TBI, and as Doug told you already, TBI developed a profile from those and sent it into CODIS. And that's when they got the call from the FBI back that they'd been a CODIS hit, but surprise of surprises, it was not a suspect, but it was another victim, and it was Marcia Trimble. Well, you can imagine the adrenaline and the energy that shot up at that particular time, because this is the first time there'd been an opening of any kind to lead to further investigation of Marcia Trimble case. So at that time we knew if we solved the DePrey case, we would solve the Marcia Trimble case. So obviously the investigation picked up speed very quickly. Bill Pridemore reviewed the file. We did find there were 2 or 3 suspects potentially in there, Jerome Barrett being one of them. Jerome Barrett was located in Memphis, where, believe it or not, he was head of the home watch in his community at that time and running a lawn care service. But among no telling what else he was doing. But they found him. They had a search warrant. They got his DNA. They brought it back, and this Doug, of course, let the cat out of the bag. They got a call back and said that it matched both. So we knew at that time that Jerome Barrett was our killer. 2008, we indicted Jerome Barrett on both cases of first-degree murder, and he was arrested and brought back to Nashville. So we had 2 cases that were 34 years old, oldest that ever been tried in Tennessee, and one of the oldest ever been tried in the country. And I was lucky, I had 2 of them, not just one. So that was great. So, start. Of course, that's Sarah DePrey. She was, as Doug said, was 19 and studying at Vanderbilt, had a job part-time. Father was a very prominent doctor. we found her coat outside her apartment door, which indicated to us that she'd probably been abducted as she was opening her door to go into her apartment. Of course, that's Marcia, that photograph that's been around. I think everybody's probably seen that photograph. You know the story of Marcia being 9 years old and delivering Girl Scout cookies out of her home on an afternoon. Those cases are so intertwined now by the evidence, by the investigation, by having a common killer, that I determined that we probably ought to go over both trials because there's so much going on in both of them. It's basically about Jerome Barrett. There's a newspaper article, and the reason I put that up is because I think the research showed there were thousands of articles done on Marcia Trimble. I mean, there were so many news stories done on her. Every anniversary, there was more stories done. There were just numerous stories done, yet there was only one newspaper article done on Sarah Dupre. So that was the difference. And that's one reason that Sarah's case didn't get investigated further, I think. Once Marcia disappeared, all the police resources went into that investigation. Jerome Barrett, 1975. And that's when he was arrested in 2008. Doug has talked some about him. He lived in a mosque in North Nashville part of the time, and he'd rented this room from someone who had an apartment too that he lived in. We never could find a job he had. He handed out pamphlets for the Muslim nation in different places. He actually used that to get on college campuses, I think, to survey for other victims. Then we get to his reign of terror that he started. He was sent here from Memphis, as Doug said, as a sex offender. He got out of prison and decided to stay here and started his reign of terror. His first victim was Sarah. And you'll see the distance on there, 0.2 miles. That's from Vanderbilt University. We use that. This is actually something we used in court in an attempt to get this evidence into the trials. But you see that happened on a weekend, 0.2 miles from Vanderbilt University on February the 2nd. Female, white, 19. The next one was Audrey Porter, and you could almost see the Belmont dorm from where Sarah was if you just walked out and looked straight down the street. It was 0.9 miles from the Vanderbilt campus. As Doug described, a very brutal rape. He spent hours with her, and he went through her dorm room and got every penny she had, got everything, searched it numerous times, raped her numerous times, made her call him God. She was praying during the rape, and he kept abusing her until she would call him God instead of praying to God. So he was a very sadistic predator as well. Next attack was Charlotte Shatson, which Doug has talked about. Her throat was cut. She was 0.4 of a mile from Vanderbilt, again, a young female white. And you notice all of these are occurring on weekends. That was his MO normally, was to go out on a weekend and look for young women if he hadn't already surveilled them. We'll talk about that in a minute. The next was Marcia, which is a variation from the weekend, and she's 5 miles away, so his pattern is broken up there. That's one reason I think they never really linked him to Trimble initially, because it's so far, and she was such a different type of victim. Diane McMillan, like he said, a very brutal rape. Used a weapon. Like Doug said, he waited for her husband to come home. That's how bad he was and how confident he was in his skills of being physical and obviously he had a weapon. He had a pistol there too, waiting to rob her husband as well. But that's just how cold-blooded he really was. She actually came back, Diane came back for the trials and actually was willing to testify if we got that evidence in trial, and she sat through and watched the whole case. Next one was Judy Ladd, another female white, 2.9 miles, so it was a little bit further from Vanderbilt. And she'd actually pulled a gun on him, but I actually believe, knowing his mentality, that he was breaking into the maintenance shed. I think he was trying to find keys to probably go back to her apartment after she was asleep and do whatever to show her that she wasn't going to scare him off with a gun. He was that type of mentality. And the police were called. He looked at another apartment and a woman there. They came and they arrested him. He had the long tweed coat on. He had two layers of clothing, so he could take his clothing off and have a different color clothing on. He had on gloves, he had a bandana as a mask, and he had a knife and a gun. So he was there, obviously, and grace of God, there wasn't another victim that particular night, but he was arrested that night. Now, he got charged in basically all of these cases, other than Sarah and Marcia's. So he got charged with all of Shatson was able to identify him, and Audrey Porter was able to identify. He confessed to Audrey Porter's, and they found jewelry in his apartment when they searched there. Diane McMillan was able to identify him, and of course Judy Ladd was going to testify about those crimes. He was tried on the Audrey Porter case and got 50 years. After that, for some reason, the district attorney's office decided not to go forward with the other cases. I guess they were satisfied with the 50 years, but the other cases they never went forward with them. At that time, Diane McMillan and Charlotte Shatson both came back for the Dupre trial and were willing to testify if this proof could come in. This evidence was part of both trials. We attempted to introduce it as 404B evidence, which is a rule of evidence that allows the state to put in evidence of other crimes to show intent, motive, or identity, and basically they have to be a signature type crime. The things we listed in this when we were arguing this, we thought the four cases, the Porter case, Shatson, McMillan, and Dupre should have come in. We listed, all of them were young white women, obviously. They were close in time and location. They were all on the weekends. He used the language white bitch with every one of them that survived. That he would call them a white bitch repeatedly while raping them. He was always armed with a weapon. He always forced fellatio first before doing any other type of sexual assault. He also took everything in their apartments or that they had of any value, including pennies, any kind of change they had, jewelry, anything, and he was always wearing a tweed overcoat. We thought our strongest argument was for the Dupre case because Marcia Trimble's case was a little bit different, obviously. We had somewhat of a unique argument for the Shatson evidence coming in the Trimble trial. It turned out that Shatson's a very unusual name, and that her family was the only Shatsons in the state of Tennessee. Now, she was living in an apartment over by the park, but her parents lived in Green Hills. And it turns out that her parents' property backed up to Marcia Trimble's parents' property. So that was too big a coincidence for me as a prosecutor. That's just bizarre. And knowing what I knew about Mr. Barrett, it was not beyond, I think, our comprehension that he was over there looking for Charlotte Shatson. She was actually in the hospital still because he'd cut her neck. But the only Shatsons in the phone book were her parents in Green Hills. He could have researched and tried to think maybe she was at her parents' home and he could get her there. We don't know for sure, but that was such a great coincidence. Of course, Judge Dozier, I can't say anything about him since he's here, so he listened to the great arguments from the state and decided this evidence didn't come in, but I'll let him.
You know, Mr. Barrett, had pled guilty to some older crimes that the police knew about and knew he was responsible for in '75, and actually was sentenced to like 60 years on some of those crimes. And the state wanted to get that other bad act in, assaulting a lady over near the Bandy campus. But what was unusual about it, and I analyzed it under 404B, but was that the lady he had assaulted and pled guilty to had been in the hospital from that assault. Her parents lived a couple of 100 yards from the Trimbles. And the state's theory was, with that unusual name in Nashville at the time, you know, you'd go in the phone book and there'd be probably that one family lived near the Trimbles, a stone's throw from the Trimbles, that he was back over there, that was their theory, he was back over there looking for her, since she didn't die, looking for her when he may have come across Marcia. But from an evidentiary standpoint, I mean, I have to evaluate that probative value. You know, that theory, is that really a viable probative theory versus the unfair prejudice? So if you'd gotten into all of that assaultive behavior, I just didn't think, you know, with the DNA and other evidence, you know, I just didn't think that was proper. But I mean, judges can't anticipate, is there going to be a conviction or not? I mean, we just have to call it based on the evidentiary rules at the time. But I didn't think that met that burden of allowing that prejudicial information in.
And it's fine now that we got the conviction. You're happy you didn't do it. But one thing that did, all defense attorneys in both cases saw this evidence that we had, and it kept him from even trying to testify. They were scared to death they'd open the door and let this in if he attempted to testify. And he was an intelligent guy. He could have taken a stand, but that kept him from testifying anyway. So we were somewhat successful in that, although I wouldn't have minded him testifying, obviously. Barrett was a true predator, though. He was intelligent. When he was in prison, he had 33 write-ups for violence. He had numerous people that had put in to be separated from him because he threatened to kill them. I think he was doing a drug ring in prison also. I actually talked to his former cellmate, and he gave me some more insight into Jerome Barrett that obviously Judge Dozier didn't know, and I didn't have the evidence to put on. But he said that he would tell him that he would surveil women all the time. He'd go to college campuses and dress up like a professor and walk around. That he would check their mailboxes to see who was living there, if they were living alone or not. And he was just basically always on the hunt for new victims. He told him when he got out of prison that he had some property down near Memphis, which he did. His family farm was in Mississippi. That he was going to build a bunker and he was going to kidnap white women and keep them slaves in the bunker. Well, hopefully that didn't happen. At least we don't know that it did. But he was a very bad predator. The thing that really upset me about him, he was better dressed than me at the trial, so I couldn't figure that out. You know, here he comes in, his pinstripe suit, pink tie, got his handkerchief there. He always had a new suit. He had more suits than I did. And that was, I think, from his daughter paying for that. So let's start with the Dupre trial. We tried that first. We made that decision to try the case first because it didn't have quite as many problems as the Trimble case did. It was going to be a shorter trial, and we thought it was best to go ahead and try it first and try to get a conviction there. There were some pretrial motions filed by the defense other than the 404B argument that we had. They asked for a change of venue, which because of all the publicity generated at the time of the arrest. And that was granted by Judge Dozier, and we went to Chattanooga. I love Chattanooga. And when we got down there, it was kind of humorous. You know, when the jury came in, it looked like they'd sent the bus to the rest home and the old Republicans convention and just cleaned it out. They were on walkers. They were they were some real conservatives too. So anyway, I love the Chattanooga jury. I've been there before. They filed what's called a Ferguson motion. We'll get into that a little bit more. There was a missing autopsy report from the autopsy that was done on Sarah. And a Ferguson motion basically says if the state destroys evidence that could be helpful to the defendant, that they could either get the case dismissed or at least get a jury charge telling them that this evidence had been destroyed. That was denied because they really couldn't prove that there had been an autopsy report or that we had ever had it in our possession and destroyed it. They challenged, we had an inmate testify that I'll talk about a little later. They challenged his testimony, say he was not credible and shouldn't be allowed to testify. Also, we had an expert testify on cause of death, Dr. Levy. This was before his marijuana experiences. And so they tried to exclude Dr. Levy from testifying. They were unsuccessful with that. So those were basically the gist of the pretrial motions in the case. This is Sarah's little apartment there. You can see there wasn't much to it, but that was torn off. So our theory was that as she was opening her door, he came from behind to get her, and she tried to run out that door as an exit down some stairs, and she was trying to get through and rip that off when he caught her at the door. This just shows all the drawers pulled out and everything, where even after he killed her, he took the time to thoroughly go through, search that apartment. There wasn't a single penny in that apartment anywhere. He searched it thoroughly, spent his time there, obviously not concerned after killing her. What were our issues in the trial, basically? Missing witnesses. Obviously, you're dealing with a 34-year-old case. You may have some missing witnesses. The medical examiner that did the autopsy, or I guess he did an autopsy, we're not sure, but he was dead. Also, the lead detective, Diane Vaughn, which Doug talked about, was deceased. So we'd lost them, but we did have Jim Sledge, who was an assistant district attorney by then in our office, who had actually been an ID officer on the scene that recovered the evidence. We had the first, Thales Fincham was the first officer on the scene. We had him. We had Dr. Dupre and his son who discovered the body, and we had some neighbors that had known her and were keeping her dog while she was on the date, and had actually gone in her apartment when she was deceased, but they didn't know it. They thought she was sleeping. So we had those. We were able to have pretty much what we needed as far as evidence. The big issue in the case was the cause of death. And you may not be able to see that, but because I can't see it from here either. But basically what it says is, I think that says, cause of manner of death unknown. Matter of death, I think, is undetermined up there, and here it has a mark with an X by autopsy. That was all we had, basically. And you've got a medical examiner, all right, he was a doctor, I don't really call him a medical examiner, saying it's unknown, the cause of death is unknown. There was actually an article in the paper, the one article they did, saying that she might have choked on her own vomit from drinking. She was actually just 0.07, so it wasn't like she was very drunk. And you can't do that anyways. So that was may have been what was going on here. We don't really know. That's Sarah there. Now, you can tell me how a medical examiner could look at that and say that's not a homicide when her apartment's ransacked. You see, that's a bite mark on her arm. You can see bruising. There's also petechiae up there that's readily visible to the human eye. We had Dr. Levy come in and testify, and he reviewed the photographs. He reviewed all the police reports. He actually read the newspaper article. He reviewed the death certificate, and he's able to say basically from the photographs and the description from the police reports that it was a homicide by asphyxiation. So we had to establish that, and that was a huge issue in this case, really the biggest issue in the case. Other DNA was also an issue. Not only did they find Barrett's DNA, but they found several other people's DNA, several males and semen on sheets and pillowcase and things of that nature. So we argued, one, we had to say, where did that come from? One was her lifestyle. She'd been in Florida the year before and lived in a 5-bedroom house with 4 other girls with a lot of parties going on. So you can imagine we were arguing what could have happened in any of those rooms with 5 college kids in there. That was one argument. Something's going on here. She bought a lot of her stuff at the thrift store, and we had experts that would testify that you can't wash DNA out 3 or 4 times. It'll stay in there, so you could actually pick DNA. It had been up from someone who owned these items before she had. I also had a friend that stayed there for a week when she was gone. So we had a male friend that stayed there for a week, so our argument was could have been him. One of the most, well, I don't call it interesting, but her brother's semen was on the sheet, so I had to convince him to come in and talk about masturbation. So that was a pretty hard sell, but we had to do that anyway. So anyway, luckily he had an alibi. He was in inpatient treatment at the time, so we didn't have to worry too much about that because he did have an alibi, but we did have to explain that. We're a little concerned about a consent defense because he is a bright individual, and, you know, it would have been, if he'd just testified, you know, it could have raised reasonable doubt. You just don't know how much we would have gotten in through the judge and stuff if he did testify. But luckily we listened to his jail calls, and he told his daughter he didn't know this girl, never heard of this girl. So we were able to put that into evidence to kind of knock out the consent defense. There's an example of all the DNA that was taken off that blanket that was on her bed. With different DNA samples that were recovered. So we had a lot of DNA, and not all of it was our suspects. This is the Barrett DNA we did have. This was actually used. This is a closing argument slide here. You can see we got beyond the world population on several of those, and you know, it's just beyond the world population on fingernail scrapings. Those were the ones that we really focused on. I used in closing argument that she was testifying from the grave, that she was able to gather evidence before she was killed that would convict her killer. Because he was the only DNA under her fingernail, so that kind of helped us rule out a lot of the other argument as far as the DNA.
The man accused of killing 9-year-old Marcia Trimble will spend the rest of his life in prison. That's because a jury today found Jerome Barrett guilty in the murder of Vanderbilt student Sarah Dupre. This comes 34 years after her death. News Channel 5's Amy Rao is live at the Birch Building downtown. Amy, the jury didn't deliberate very long.
Rory, after just an hour and a half of deliberations, the jury came back with their decision.
Guilty of first-degree murder and fixes punishment in life imprisonment in the state penitentiary.
This comes after a day and a half of testimony as well as closing arguments this morning. The prosecution dramatically made the jury and everyone in the courtroom sit in silence for 30 seconds and then said Barrett spent 2.5 minutes silencing 19-year-old Sarah Dupre. The defense argued the prosecution's jail witness was unreliable. The DNA could have been there from another day and that Barrett may have had a consensual relationship with Dupre. Despite their arguments and insistence that nothing proves this was a homicide, a jury determined otherwise and determined not only was it murder, it was premeditated.
We were happy with the verdict. We felt it was justice after 34 years, and really happy for the family after all this time. They've been through so much.
And for the record, Jerome Barrett showed no emotion today. He showed no emotion the day we got him. He's never shown any emotion, which is exactly what we anticipated from him. So no surprises from him.
Although the family hugged and cried as the verdict was read, Jerome Barrett just stared with an empty stare at the jury, and then he shook his lawyer's hand and walked out of the courtroom back to jail, where he will spend the rest of his life. Reporting live from the Birch Building, Amy Rao, News Channel 5 HD.
Thanks, Amy. Barrett is set to go on trial for the murder of Marcia Trimble in July.
As that said, the defense argument in the case of closing was cause of death was their basic argument. We couldn't prove the cause of death. And also there was a possible consent defense, even though he hadn't testified to anything. And we got to stand up and say, well, I guess the defense is calling his his own client a liar for telling his sister he didn't know Mr. Dupre. That's her father right there, Dr. Dupre. And it was kind of an interesting thing when Pat Pastigliano and I went out to their house in Green Hills and met with them to let them know that we had felt we had their daughter's killer. We sat on the front porch in a rocking chair with Dr. Dupre. And he really didn't want us to go forward with it. He told us he'd prefer that we would just leave it alone and not prosecute it. And I don't know exactly why, other than whether he didn't want to relive it, but I always thought he had a little bit of guilt because he and Sarah were kind of having a little bit of tough relationship at the time, and she was living over there in that kind of shoddy little apartment. And I think he felt a little bit of guilt maybe about what may have happened. I don't know, but we convinced him to go forward. We told him we had an obligation. We had to protect other victims, that we had to go forward. He agreed to cooperate with us. His son was a doctor in Oklahoma. I called him. He said, well, yeah, can I come in and just testify one day and then fly out? And I said, yeah, you can if you want to. So he came. But when we actually got into trial, you watched their daughter, son, and him just really bonding into it. And, of course, the son stayed for the whole thing. And after the verdict, he was so emotional. He hugged me 3 different times and cried. And he was not the crying type, believe me, and thanked me so much. And they all thanked us just numerous times. It was like this had been something in their background for so long that they hadn't talked about. And I think he felt totally vindicated that Sarah's lifestyle had nothing to do with the death. He had nothing to do with the death. She just ran into basically a psychopath, a predator. She was just in the wrong place at the wrong time. So there were some ineffective assistance of counsel claims in this case. One was they had an expert on the cause of death they didn't call. I'd basically researched him, and he'd made a lot of strange findings from time to time in court, and I showed those to the defense. They decided, made a tactical decision not to call him, so that wasn't an issue. They didn't cross the DNA expert, which he claimed was ineffective. Of course, they had their own DNA expert that had reviewed it all, and they really didn't have anything to cross on. Claimed they didn't spend enough time with him, and that they didn't really discuss whether he should testify or not. And of course, they said we spent plenty of time. So there's really no real issues on the ineffective assistance in the case. So. Let's get to the Trimble case before my throat wears out. And there were some pretrial motions in the Trimble case, obviously. There was no change of venue, I can tell you that. It was kind of funny when talking to the defense attorney when he asked Jerome Barrett if he wanted to change the venue, and I can't really tell you what he said, but it wasn't very nice about Chattanooga's. They challenged our search warrant, alleging that Bill Pridemore had put some information in there that wasn't correct. The judge found otherwise and upheld the search. They challenged our inmate testimony that I'll get to in a minute, saying that it wasn't reliable and shouldn't be allowed to testify. The judge ruled in our favor there. I think we did some issues on prior convictions if he testified. They also filed a motion to continue the case, which was denied by the judge. I think it was about 2 months before the trial. Things happen in normal cases. When they're 34 years old, they said, we found this box over here with all these tapes in it. You know, and I said, well, bring it up. And of course, it was a Marcia Trimble case. There must have been 100 tapes in there. They taped calls coming into the Trimble residence. They'd interviewed everybody known to man. So anyway, I just called up Jim McNamara and I said, get on over here. You can listen to all of these things. And so they filed a motion to continue based on that. But the judge just told them to work a little bit harder and denied their continuance. We had a couple of, since it's CLE, we're supposed to talk a little bit about ethics. We had a couple of ethical, what I consider little ethical dust-ups during that trial. About, I guess, as a week before the trial, one of the defense attorneys shows up in my office with an order saying that I should turn the blouse over to her. And I looked at it. It was an ex parte order, obviously. we had no notice of it, and that's not the way it works anyway. So I've noticed there's 2 or 3 people in my church here, so I can't tell you what I told her, but anyway, she didn't get the blouse. We ended up going to court like we should have done the first time, and turned out that it would have taken like 10 weeks or something to test it and get it back. So obviously we were a week out of trial. So I think it was more trying to get a continuance that wasn't granted before than it was actually wanting to test that blouse, which had been tested, gosh, I don't know, at least 3 or 4 times. So they didn't get to test the blouse, long story short. There's also on Friday night, always on Friday night, before you go to trial on Monday, I get a call to have an alibi witness, which is in Memphis, which is good for me, obviously. So I spent about probably 6 or 8 hours trying to run this person down. Finally did. Spent a lot of my weekend where I should have been doing other trial prep, running down an alibi. We were obviously going to object to it if they tried to use it because of the late notice, but I found a guy, he was a paraplegic, and he said, there's no way in hell I'm coming up there. So that was the end of that. So I don't know where that came from, but anyway, they didn't ever bring the alibi witness. They only made me work on the weekend, so, which I would have done anyway. That's the opening to the garage where Marsha was found. That just shows you how cluttered it was. And that square is actually where her body is over there in the corner. And this is how she was found after the blue pool was taken off of her. She was found on, that's a bag of fertilizer there with her cookies. And I think all of her change that she'd gotten was missing. What were our trial issues with Marsha's case? Well, just like the other one, we had missing witnesses. Her father, Charlie, was dead. All the lab personnel that had participated in the famous slide were deceased. Several police officers were deceased, neighbors. There were a lot of missing witnesses that we might have been able to call, but we did have Marsha's mother, Virginia. We had Lieutenant Tom Cathy, thank goodness. He saved the case basically because he did such an excellent job. He went in that garage wearing gloves, put every piece of evidence in a paper bag, separately sealed and signed by him and with a complaint number on it. So that helped us tremendously in our chain of evidence. We had Marie Maxwell, obviously, who we'll talk at length about, who was one of the key witnesses. And also we had the neighbor and the person who discovered her body. So we were able to put it together thanks to Lieutenant Cathy. Location of the body, that was a huge deal in this particular case. So. And the time of death, both. The police, I hate to use the word cover up probably, but after she was found some 31 days later, the police got together and their theory was she hadn't been there, that she'd been placed there some other time, that somebody had her in a freezer somewhere or they brought her back to the scene or something. And the defense actually called 3 police officers that said they'd searched that building. One of them was a pretty good guy, and he admitted, said, look, I went in there. I can't say she wasn't in there. I went in there and looked around. I didn't see her, but I'm not going to say she wasn't in there. She could very well be in. So he's kind of a nothing witness. The other 2 came in and told us kind of, I thought, bizarre story that after the body was found, the next day they were called out to a location. They didn't know the body had been found, like they were the only people in Nashville, I guess it did. But they didn't know the body had been found, and the lieutenant there says, anybody remember anything unusual about your searches now? 31 days later, we're just getting together, and they both raise their hands and say, yeah, we remember this little garage we searched over there. Out of all the buildings we searched, we remember that one. And he said, well, draw a diagram of it. And they said, yeah, we remember there was a golf shoe on the wall, and there was a blue pool in there, and there was some fertilizer bags over in this corner. And that's what they remembered. They didn't know the body had been found, of course, on those fertilizer bags. And they drew a little diagram, and they were sure she wasn't in there. They thoroughly searched it. And that was basically what they testified to. Now, we were lucky that both of them had problems with the police department, had been terminated. Both of them in their records had had been charged with lying to their superiors, which is always a good thing. One of them had been also terminated because he leaked a raid to the gambler, and another one had been terminated because he stole a car. So they weren't the most stand-up police recruits you could have at the time, but that was their testimony, and we had a rebuttal witness, Billy Butler, who was a detective at the time, hadn't been fired from the police department, who had gone out there with them, and he said, I looked through this hole, and there was a hole in the back of the garage, and I saw them. They were up front, just messing around, so they weren't in there more than a couple of minutes, and they left and said we were taken back out there and asked to draw a diagram by looking at the garage. So he was able to rebut that kind of ridiculous story that they had. Obviously, everybody was interested in the time of death and where she was located. We had Dr. Bass from the Body Farm, of course, a very famous expert to testify, and also Dr. Francisco, who did the autopsy, but was still alive and from Memphis, and they both concurred that she'd been killed the day she disappeared. They considered lava infestation, lividity of the body, which is very important. They looked at all the temperatures during the day she was missing, and they determined, that she died there in the garage. Where she'd been placed was the place she'd been killed. So they didn't really have an expert to rebut that. So our experts, I think, were able to rebut the police officers pretty good. And I'm 100% sure she was in that garage the whole time. I really am, talking to the experts. You just can't argue with their science. And a lot of people say, well, why didn't they smell her? Well, she wasn't that decomposed, really, because the temperatures were pretty cool during that period of time in February, and she was laying on fertilizer, which would mask any smell pretty much because it has such a strong smell. It's an interesting thing, though. The defense made a tactical move where they brought out that he was in custody on March the 12th, that he'd been arrested. We were able to just say the police got him, but they admitted he was in custody on March the 12th, hoping to argue that the body hadn't been there, and if somebody put it there after March the 12th, it couldn't have been Barrett because he was locked up. So it's kind of an interesting tactical decision by the defense. You can see there the location. You've already seen this particular photo, I see, but you can see it's fairly close to everything. So it wasn't far at all where she had to be taken. So the police dismissed her. That's about the only conclusion you can have. Marie Maxwell. She's up there somewhere. There she is. Marie's a wonderful person. She was Dean of Students at Harpeth Hall for a long period of time. And back when this occurred, she was a young teacher that was living close to Marcia. And she was the one that reported seeing Marcia last in a driveway with, she thought were two individuals. She first stated to the police that the person had a dark face and a long coat, which was consistent maybe with Mr. Barrett. She thought there were three people there. She knew Marcia. She thought the other one was March Edgerton, who was a 10-year-old little boy that lived in the neighborhood. She was interviewed, I think, close to 30 times. They took her deposition. They hypnotized her. She didn't think she got hypnotized, but they did attempt to hypnotize her, whether they did or not. She was just constantly under pressure because she was a key witness, she thought. And she'd only had just a few second glance through a hedge. So this is her house is right here. And there's where Marcia was at the hedge. That's actually Marcia's dog right there. That's Marcia's house. The dog is running up the driveway. So she pulled in, had her young child. She had to get out of the car. And that's what she was looking at, right through here. She was downhill, looking up at these individuals. So that was what her view was, looking through the hedge in just a brief few seconds. So Jeffrey Womack. Now, she didn't ever identify Jeffrey Womack, but she was asked to do a sketch. And there's a sketch, I think, when she was hypnotized. Now, you know, it doesn't look like a dark face to me, but maybe it was. But anyway, you look up there, and she's saying 5'3" to 5'5". That's a real problem for us, that she's saying a person is 5'3" to 5'5", and Jerome Barrett's 6'3". So that was a real problem for us. So I talked to Marie, and I said, all right, Marie, how tall was Marcia? She said, well, I think she was 4 feet tall. I said, so I'm able to say, well, Marie, if she was 4'10", then the other person would be 10 inches taller, would they not? So you would go from 5'3", you know, to 6'1" to 6'3", which fit Mr. Barrett. So we were able to get around that issue pretty well with her saying Marcia was, she guessed was 4 feet tall, so the other person would have been a lot taller than Marcia and in the 6 foot range. But that was a major problem. I think the defense put that, yeah, I believe they put that in. One of us, I may have put it in and just to cover it, but I think that was more of a lot of pressure being put on Marie Maxwell. And she said that sketch had nothing to do with her memory. So that was good. Jeffrey Womack. You've heard a lot about Jeffrey. And that was kind of the elephant in the room for the trial. We weren't sure whether they would try to go and say Jeffrey Womack's a killer and bring in police officers. Because there were a lot of them out there that would still tell me that, oh yeah, it's Jeffrey Womack. And they'd even ask me, said, well, how did Jeffrey Womack and Jerome Barrett hook up? I said, they didn't, guys. But they still believe it, a lot of them. And we were afraid they would call some of the old investigators in there to try that. And I'd actually met with Jeffrey Womack. John Hollins allowed me to meet with him and interview him. And he was willing to testify if we needed him. But they chose not to go with the Jeffrey Womack defense, which is good. So other DNA, what I like to call is that damn slide. There it is. That's a report supposedly done after the autopsy. Now, everybody in here was dead. Every one of them. Dr. Bell was dead. The woman, Miss Fowler, was dead. The person who took the slide in was dead. They were all dead. So what does she say there? She says that there's an intact spermatozoa, although the chemical reaction that should be present for semen is not there, but she sees an intact spermatozoa, which is not really possible after 31 days, I would say scientifically anyway. They usually last about 72 hours. So anyway, that was the report we had. So how did we address that? As I told you, that they found DNA on the slide that was submitted by them. And it was a male DNA, and then they had a combination of 3 to 5 people on this vaginal slide from Marcia Trimble. Was this actually from Marcia Trimble? Dr. Bell was the doctor that supposedly did the swab, but he didn't do the autopsy. So you're saying, well, why does a doctor who's not doing an autopsy do a vaginal swab? There's no explanation because he's dead. We don't know. Ann Fowler, I think, may have had a master's degree. She didn't have a PhD. She wasn't an expert in anything. And she was the only one that saw the spermatozoa. This didn't surface till 1990. So where was it for all those years? Why couldn't they find it? Why does it all of a sudden show up in 1990? And then there's one number, and that's the only thing that identified it as Marcia Trimble was a lab number on it. So was there a mistake with a number written? We don't know where it was for 4 days. It shows being checked in 4 days after the autopsy, so we don't know where it was. And then the intact sperm, we had expert testimony that would be highly unusual. We had multiple contributors on there. And then there's no Marcia Trimble DNA. So how do you do a vaginal swab and not get Marcia Trimble's DNA? So our argument was basically, this is not an accurate slide that you can trust. we don't believe it came from Marsha Trimble. Argument 2 was their sperm. The only person that says is Ann Fowler, and Dr. Francisco and Megan Clement, who was a DNA expert, both testified that it wouldn't exist. It wouldn't be a sperm like that 31 days later. The chemical test didn't confirm it. There was no other expert confirmation that saw it. And the real thing is there was no vaginal injury to Marsha Trimble. Her hymen was intact, no sperm in her panties. She was fully clothed. So to believe that, you would have to believe that 3 to 5 different individuals sexually assaulted a 9-year-old girl, did no vaginal injury to her at all, left her hymen intact, no sperm dripped out, and then they fully dressed her back with jeans that buttoned down and left her. That's what you'd have to find to believe this slide. So it just didn't make any sense to us. And then we can argue also DNA transfer, that a lot of these people on this slide, Dr. Petroni, who was here, did a vaginal exam of Marsha before she was sent to Memphis without gloves, of course. Dr. Bell, they didn't wear gloves back then because they didn't have DNA a lot. Ann Fowler touched it, several lab employees touched it, multiple profiles, and our experts testified about DNA transfer and how it's possible to transfer DNA to those slides from all the different people that touched it, so it wouldn't necessarily be 5 people. So that was our argument, that you couldn't believe this slide. We actually filed a motion to suppress that slide. We weren't going to put it in because, you know, it was our argument was believe our good DNA, don't believe their bad DNA. So we didn't think there could be a chain of evidence established, and I'm not sure the state could have gotten this in. But Judge Dozier allowed the defense to put on a defense, which now is fine with me. But we'll hear from the judge.
Usually the district attorney is, and they wanted their DNA evidence introduced. Theirs was more recent, you know, in terms of the match. But the defense also wanted DNA evidence from the initial autopsy to show an unknown DNA sample from 75 when she was sent to Memphis and Dr. Francisco did the autopsy down there. The police department went, I think, maybe in 90 or sometime in the early 90s and retrieved those slides and all in an effort to find DNA and found an unknown third person. So from an evidentiary standpoint, the defendant wanted that in. So it was a little unusual that you had the state challenging chain of custody when usually it's the reverse. Usually it's the defense wanting to challenge the state's DNA or what photos or whatever, murder weapon, whatever the chain of custody issue is.
Talking about chain of evidence, I'll just show you, that's an example of the blouse. How many places it went, how many people had it. It was 3 different labs, I think. It was in the DA's office safe for a while. It was in the property room. You know, it went to the FBI, went to the TBI, went to Boston. It went a lot of places. So that would have been a nightmare for us if it hadn't been for Lieutenant Cathy and how he collected the evidence. That's just an example. That's the genes. That's how many places they were sent back and forth over the years to be tested. So chain of evidence could have been a nightmare for us, but we were able to establish it pretty clearly, I think, with some of the people we still had alive. Now let's talk about the real DNA evidence. That's Marsha, and that's the slide we actually used in the trial. The FBI was able to come up with 1 in 6 trillion, which is pretty strong, and it's semen on her blouse. I think would be pretty consistent with enforcing fellatio of Marsha. And then we got 8% over there. The 8% of the population would have had the DNA profile that was on her genes, and Mr. Barrett was one of those 8%. So that was just kind of an add-on there. But that was very strong DNA evidence. We also had these 2 characters. Mr. Antor was a small-time fraud kind of guy, and he was getting deported. but he was in jail over here, and he got the luck of the draw. He got to be Barrett's roommate. So he testified. Barrett told him he saw a fight. One thing, this guy kept calling Barrett a baby killer, and Barrett went after him, and he basically said, "I've killed 4 people, and I'll kill you." As I call it. Judge allowed him to testify that he heard him say, "I've killed before," basically sanitized it a little bit so he didn't get into 4 people. He also heard a statement that he killed blue-eyed girls, which didn't get to come in. But the key one with Mr. Antar that did come in was he testified that Jerome Barrett told him he killed Marcia Trimble, but he didn't rape her. And why that was so important was because nobody knew at that time that she hadn't been vaginally penetrated, because all they knew was the publicity was all about this slide that she'd been vaginally penetrated. But so if Antar was going to make that up, he would have said he raped her, but he didn't. He said he told me he killed her, but he didn't rape her. To me, that's why I've always wondered. I said, Barrett's a pretty sharp guy. After we took his DNA, why didn't he take off? Why did he sit down there in Memphis? And the reason was because I think he knew about the vaginal slide, and he knew he hadn't penetrated her vaginally, and he didn't probably remember leaving semen on her blouse, but he thought we were looking at DNA in the vaginal area of Marcia Trimble, and he knew he was home free. That's why he didn't run. Of course, that was a mistake on his part. But, so Shelton Antar basically testified about 2 different statements that he made, indicated he'd killed before, that he killed Marcia Trimble. We didn't have to make any kind of agreement with Mr. Antar other than write to immigration people and say he cooperated, which I don't think helped him. I think they still sent him out of the country after his testimony. So. And then Mr. Napper was in on drug offenses. He got into it in the TV room with Barrett, got in a fight with him over the TV, and Barrett said basically the same thing to him, that he'd killed 4 people and he'll kill him. So he was able to testify the same conversation was made to him that he'd killed before. And all he wanted to get transferred to Smith County, and which we were able to do since he would now be labeled snitch here in Davidson County. So he got to finish. He didn't have it about 3 more months on his sentence. So we really didn't have to offer them anything. So defense didn't have a lot to go with to jump on those particular guys. The defense argument in the case was basically reasonable doubt, that there were too many questions unanswered. They argued about the DNA from Memphis. They talked about these guys as being unreliable, and why did we have to rely on these guys if our DNA was any good? It made a very good closing argument, basically just on reasonable doubt, and the time of death was a big issue they argued too. Tell you a little bit of a funny story about the closing arguments. I've kind of got this thing I do during trials, kind of superstitious. I always go and buy 1 or 2 new ties for every big trial I'm going to have, just to make myself feel new or something. I don't know. But anyway, so I go over to Macy's on Saturday night before closing. They've got a sale on, so I find this dynamite red striped tie. Looks prosecutor all over it. I'm ready to get some blood. So I put that tie on my white shirt, my blue pinstripe suit, and I'm ready to rock. I walk in, I sit down, I look over at the fence table, and there's Jim McNamara in his blue suit, his white shirt, and the same stinking tie. I said, this can't be happening. So they won't know which one's saying what, but of course, we look like twins, except I was better looking. But anyway, let's get to the good part.
In the state of Tennessee versus Jerome Sidney Barrett. We, the jury, find the defendant, Jerome Sidney Barrett, count 1, guilty of second-degree murder, and fix his punishment and imprisonment in the penitentiary for 44 years. Count 2, guilty of second-degree murder, and fix his punishment and imprisonment in the penitentiary for 44 years.
You can turn that document in. Anything further from the state?
No, Your Honor.
Anything further, Mr. McNamara, on behalf of Mr. Barrett?
No, Your Honor.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, I appreciate very much your service to the court and your community in this case. You'll be discharged from this case and from your jury service. You can step down the hall with the court officer.
Now, you heard the sentence was 44 years. I think we've got Judge Dozier here again who's going to talk a little.
Jury sentencing obviously was the big thing that was different now versus then, and he had the right to, you know, have the jury impose any sentence if they convicted him of any lesser included offense, which they did in terms of second-degree murder.
Yeah, it was only second-degree murder, but it was interesting they gave him 44 years because we don't know. We speculate a little bit because Marcia would have been 44. That's when they returned the verdict, so we don't know if that's why they gave 44 years. It didn't really matter. We just wanted a guilty verdict because we already had the life sentence. So this just shows you some of the press coverage there was for these two trials. I think Katie Miller may be standing over there beside me somewhere. That might be her. But anyway, that's just, both of these trials were covered in numerous media outlets, and it was very extensive. After the trial, there was a press conference, and Virginia Trimble spoke. And Virginia's just a super lady. We've got to know each other very well through victims' organizations, and we actually went to Washington, D.C. and presented this case up there where she spoke. This was actually, this case was National Case of the Year for the FBI for DNA, so we got to go to Washington and present up there. And Marcia was saved just a week before her death and was baptized, and she made that drawing afterwards, 3 crosses, and that was very, very close to Miss Trimble's heart, and she presented it to Captain Miller because, you know, of his dogged pursuit of the wrong guy most of the time, but anyway, she appreciated his effort anyway. So she presented that to Mickey, and that was a very, very special moment. Then we had the sentencing of Mr. Barrett.
Jerome Sidney Barrett will never get out of prison. A judge today ruled Barrett's 44-year sentence for killing Marcia Trimble will go after he's finished his life sentence for the murder of Vanderbilt student Sarah Dupre. News Channel 5's Steve Hazlip went to the courtroom to hear what the judge said, something Jerome Barrett apparently didn't want to do.
The side door of the courtroom opened for convicted killer Jerome Barrett to enter, but he wouldn't do it. Finally, the judge ordered him to, and Barrett trudged in, muttering, "This is a charade." He never looked at Virginia Trimble, the mother of the 9-year-old Girl Scout he murdered in 1975. He spoke briefly, defiantly to the court, saying,
Yeah, I understand. Maybe you know what the decision might ought to be.
While his lawyer pleaded for Barrett's 44-year sentence for killing Marcia Trimble be served at the same time as a previous murder conviction, the killer stood with his back to the court.
He's just showing his true colors, his total disrespect for the law and for our system.
The judge's ruling was quick and clear. Barrett will pay separately for Marcia's murder.
In the court's opinion, a sentence for that crime, which has been a long time coming, needs to be long enough to keep Mr. Barrett permanently incarcerated.
I wanted him to be responsible for Marcia's murder. She didn't have a choice. She had no choice. He took her choice away when he killed her.
Virginia Trimble says it's finally over for her and detectives like Mickey Miller, who used DNA evidence to reopen Nashville's biggest cold case.
We didn't think it was going to take that long. And, you know, many labs and interviewing a whole lot of people. And so it's, you know, it does feel like it's finally there and that all of it paid off.
Persistence and patience paid off for everyone except the killer.
Hopefully, this will close Mr. Barrett's
ability to hurt anyone else. And
Steve Hayslip, News Channel 5 HD.
Virginia Trimble was going to speak during today's sentencing hearing, but instead wrote a long letter that she hopes Barrett will read in prison. In it, she says she forgives him and hopes he finds peace in prison.
After that, obviously there was post-conviction. Mr. Barrett filed a post-conviction alleging a few ineffective assistance of counsels, but although his trial team really did a good job, he alleged they should have called an alibi witness, which they didn't call it post-conviction. He alleged they should have tested the DNA, which they didn't do on post-conviction either, about not getting continuance, just basic inmate complaints. So that was denied by Judge Dozier. So, you know, that's really all I have. This is really truly a tragedy for the victims, their families, but not only them, there were so many other people's lives impacted by this. You look at Jeffrey Womack, you look at Marge Edgerton, who I dealt with some, who was 10 years old, and there was intense pressure put on him to remember things that probably he couldn't remember. I don't really think he was in that driveway. We'll never know who was in that driveway with Marcia. I don't think probably anybody was there. It may have been her dog or something, but Marie Maxwell just wasn't sure. But you look at Marie Maxwell, how much pressure was put on her, interviewed 30 times, just trying so hard to come up with the answer that she didn't have. So, you know, so many people were impacted, and really this entire community was impacted by this case. I don't think Nashville, like they've said, will ever be the same after this crime. It changed on that day because of Jerome Barrett, who truly is where he belongs. Although at that time there wasn't a death penalty, I wish there was. I would have felt very, very good about seeking the death penalty for Mr. Barrett, because he's truly one of the few that deserves it. Thank you.